Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Robert Schmid, Deloitte Digital's Chief IoT Technologist, also known as Mr. IoT. This week on Coffee with Mr. IoT, I am talking with Adam Mussomeli, a principal in our Deloitte practice, and we're going to talk about the value of IoT, one of the most talked about topics, I think. And Adam, welcome to our show. Thank you for joining us. What is it with value? Why do I talk to you about value? You and I spend a lot of time offline talking about value. Give us your intro, and you're an expert at this. I just enjoy talking to you about value and Deloitte and IoT.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Robert. It's great to be here, and we do talk about value a lot, and I think it's because when we think about IoT specifically, or more generally, some of the things you and I are doing in digital, executives, they want to bring new capabilities and tools to their business, but they want to do it for more than just experimental reasons. They want to have a business result. And so oftentimes, as we go into a situation and we start having discussions, at some time it cycles around to, so what's the ROI on this? And why would I want to make a different decision and perhaps go in a new direction or evolve my business?
So I'm going to come back to value and ROI, but I just have a question for you. Do you think when they started the iPhone, they had a clear value in mind, or do you think that was experimental? And when is experimental actually justified? What's your thought on that, experiential versus clearly identified value?
Well, I think that when you're in an innovation space, and I think for certain today, as we think about IoT, industrial IoT, there's some proven use case studies in business, but certainly people are learning as they go a bit. It's hard to peg down the exact value, but I'm certain as they brought out that product, or any company brings out any product, they do it because they do want to make money, right? They may be altruistic, and they may be, they may have a lot of things they want to do with that particular product, but generally it has to boost the bottom line in some way, shape, or form, or I'm sure their shareholders would be, and stakeholders be a little upset with them.
It's interesting. I often think about this because, I don't know, I find myself very interested in new things and wonder how they apply to business. And, I wonder, what was the value AWS thought or Amazon thought when they started AWS? What's the value when Google does Google X projects, right? And what risk do they put against some of these things? What risk do we put against stuff when we do our value calculations?
Well, it's not easy, right? There are some tried and true things we can look at. So you might try and find a like-as comparison to a certain situation, or in our case, a service compared with a product. And from there, you may get a sample profile. And then based on our best projections of what might happen in the future, adjust that a little bit. But I don't think it's a strict mathematical calculation that we can do yet, or that would even want to do. I think to some extent, we kind of want to crowdsource everybody's experience, and then perhaps filter that through some of the algorithms to think about the risk profile and associated value. Because to your point, Robert, nobody truly knows, or usually you don't exactly know what's going to happen. And many times products take kind of a different direction than you might have originally anticipated.
I'm going to share one of my very first work stories with you. Few people probably know this, but I have a master's in petroleum engineering. And, risk is very, very common in petroleum engineering. You don't really know what you're going to find when you start drilling and all these kind of things. So I learned at school Monte Carlo analysis, right? And when I started at Procter & Gamble, I was asked to do this study on an introduction of a product. And so they told me, well, the assumption is we're going to sell X. And I'm like, why aren't we using Monte Carlo? Why don't we go and give a range and say it goes from X minus to X plus, and the distribution is this and that. And so my boss said, oh, that's interesting, let's do that. And when I then showed this to management, it was a real mind boggler for them to actually don't have actual numbers anymore, because they wanted to see at the bottom line, well, we're going to make X amount of millions. And I said, no, we're going to make X to Y with that probability. It was really interesting. So I know you find yourself in this all the time. Why don't you talk a little bit? I know what we spend a lot of time on talking is how can we actually take value, and instead of having people pay us, Deloitte, for our projects, a fixed fee or time and material, we go and share risk with them. How does that work?
I'm gonna get right to that, but I just want to pile on maybe a little bit of what you just said, because that really is a core part of the experience and why we do some of the things I'm going to share here. It's very hard, I think, for people to think in ranges and probabilities around those ranges versus averages. And by the way, Robert, we haven't talked about this, but we might have a little bit of a common background, because 30 years ago when I started, I was in the petroleum industry.
Oh.
And one of the reasons I joined and what they asked me to do was think about how do you take option pricing theory and apply it to real assets, such as when am I going to drill a hole in the ground to try and find oil, right? And that's really where a lot of what we do today came from, was some of the thinking that we started back then.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. Interesting. Just kind of side note there, but I think specifically, especially with clients in areas like this, where they know there's something there and there's a lot of good reasons to do it, and there's maybe different value streams too. So there's a money side of it. Then there's also just maybe raising the water level and giving the folks that work there, so the talent, new skills, new capabilities, a better work experience overall. But it's hard to just take the risk while they perhaps pay us. So we're getting ours with certainty, they're not. So our concept is, let's co-invest. Let's figure out what it takes to go ahead and get this done. Name any number you want. And then let's let everything we do in some way, shape, or form ride on some form of a contingency basis, right? So that, ultimately we only get our fees in this particular case, if we're working on something IoT, when the client starts to see value as well, right? So it's a shared value, a shared risk approach is really what we try to get to.
Give me examples of what value we go and hinge our success on. I mean, I know we talk about this all the time, but I'd love to hear from you. What do you see happening in the market? What do you see people doing around that value? What do we jointly what do we join risk on?
So there's a couple different things. Robert, I think that, at a very high level, all supply chain problems, if we're going to try to apply IoT to it and solve some of them, they boil down to one of four things, or maybe some combination thereof. And I like to call them the 4 V's, right? So you got a visibility problem. You can't see what's happening, and that's creating some sort of lost value. There's a variability problem, right? So things are fluctuating and we don't know how to deal with it. Maybe we can't predict it, that sort of thing. There's a volume problem. There's just a lot of volume coming, or a little bit of volume coming, and maybe we're set up to deal with that, and maybe we're not. And then the last thing is velocity or speed. Things are just moving, at different speeds, or a lot slower than we anticipate, or a lot quicker than we anticipate. So those 4 V's form the root cause basis of all problems. And what that ultimately results in from a supply chain perspective is, way too much cost. So we're eating into our margins. Way too much inventory, so we're investing a lot in stuff that doesn't necessarily move, or an asset management problem where maybe the assets are too full and we can't deliver, or maybe they're underutilized, right? And so we're not getting full value out of them. So a lot of the ways we attach value to it is we say, look, what we're going to do through using IoT is we're going to solve one or some combination of those V's. And we think when we do that, we'll be able to better manage assets, reduce inventory, increase service out to your customer and client base, and take operating margin out. And we calibrate what those might be, and we attach what we do to the success of achieving those outcomes.
It's interesting to me, because one of the things you have to have in order to show improvement is you have to have a baseline on all 4 of those, or either whatever you want to actually improve on.
Mm-hmm.
Which ones do you find the easiest one to get a baseline on?
Well, so you're absolutely right. You need a baseline from the start, and baselines are a funny thing, because no baseline is completely static. There's a couple different reasons where your baseline might look like some form of a curve, but I think the best you can do there is look at how did something operate over the past year, or maybe over the past 2 years, and then look at, is there a reasonable expectation that it will continue to operate like that moving forward? And if not, so something's changing. supply base is changing, the way you're entering into the market with your product is changing or something like that, then let's fluctuate that baseline. And what we get is, the best idea of what that baseline should be, somewhat theoretical, but anchored in how it's been operating over time, moving forward, right?
I don't know. Sometimes I find myself, it's interesting. I love to geek out on tech, but I also can sort of geek out on math or statistics for that matter. We talked about the baseline. The other thing is the length, right?
Yep.
And so I have this theory, and I want to bounce it off of you and see if you agree with this. My theory is we always said that after a project, there is a slump in performance, right? We had with big ERP implementations, and we always prepared, or I prepared my clients that after a go live right there and then, actually productivity might go slightly down and then it'll go up again, right?
Yeah.
So that's the past. And I'm thinking that when you look forward, we talk a lot about agile and how actually you have a minimal viable product in much, much quicker times, and then you iterate on those. And so therefore, I'd like to just make the assumption that value comes quicker than we're used to. Is that what you're saying?
100% it is. And so two thoughts. One is to your point around math and statistics. I love that too. So when I first got into this and we started constructing baselines, we got pretty deep into that. And I think the thing we learned out of that was, keeping it simple and understandable and easier for a group of people to correlate around and sort of understand is a better thing. So we've backed off of some of that. But I think in an agile world specifically, whereas before, if we went on something that involves some sort of technology journey, it might take a year, maybe 2 years. In some cases, maybe a little bit longer than that, depending on how quickly you're rolling it out to get some value. Now we're seeing clients start to get value in 6 to 8 weeks. Now, to your point on minimal viable product, something around those lines, it might be a smaller bit of value, right? But it's something that you can latch onto and say, hey, we got this. We didn't have it before. We have the capability that leads directly to it. It makes sense to do another 6 weeks, another 8 weeks, whatever it might be, and continue to expand from there. And that sort of quick win and the tangible evidence around it absolutely propels the project forward. And there's not so much, hey, I'm betting on the come. At some point, this will pay off. It is as you're doing it.
Question for you. We got to go to Tech Fluency, right? We had a whole Tech Fluency training. Did you get to go to that too, or was it just on our side of the practice?
It was just on your side of the practice. So what I did is I leaned on some of our partners and got some of those materials. And, I've been working with you guys pretty closely. So I don't know if I'd call myself fluent, but engaged, maybe engaged.
You're great, right? I mean, when we work, I love working with you because, the strategy and the tech really flow into each other.
Yes.
I like that. But what I wanted to talk about, so for people who don't know, we have a whole Tech Fluency program going on within Deloitte to get everybody to be consistently tech fluent across different technologies. And so I wanted to briefly talk about that. By the way, in case you're just joining, you are watching Coffee with Mr.IoT. My name is Robert Schmid, Deloitte's digital chief IoT technologist, and we have Adam Mussomeli with us today, and we're talking about value in IoT and across our business. But what I wanted to talk about Tech Fluency, which I thought was interesting, and I think it comes back to this minimal viable product. I grew up very much thinking of requirements and checkpoints and so forth. And when you think of Agile, it's all about getting a product up the door. And actually sometimes, the whole point of minimal viable, what might be viable is probably very different from what I thought my requirements were. So it really is an interesting mind shift. Question for you on mind shift. I had a very smart, very great CFO as my boss for a long time. Actually, he was my boss twice. But one of the things that I know he's very sensitive to when it comes to sharing value is, companies like to keep their value, and now we're talking about sharing risk and sharing value. What's your thought on this? What goes on around sharing value? How long do people share value? How real is it? What goes on around this? Just give us some thoughts.
Well, at least for the interactions with us and our clients. I'm sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback.
I'm going to go on mute.
Okay. So at least for us in the way we think about risk sharing with our clients, we make sure that they get the majority of the value. So what we want to do, what we always say is, look, we want to hit a triple. If I could use a sports analogy, we want you to hit a grand slam home run, right? So the idea is we'll invest jointly, call it 50-50, whatever the cost of the project is to do. And then we'll earn our fees as they earn their value, but we will always cap ours. Right, so we'll earn a certain amount, and then we'll say there's no more than that, and you keep everything beyond that. And that's really the way we do it at the end of the day, because we're there for a certain amount of time, and we want to be compensated fairly for it if we deliver. But it's not our company, it's not our product, it's not our ongoing concern. It's really theirs. That's the way we think about it.
Yeah, I love that approach, and I appreciate you mentioning it here. It's a great way to go. Let me switch around, and I'm always curious, how does all this risk talk and sharing risk and sharing reward, how does that come out in your personal life? Because I gotta believe there's something that you do in your personal life the same way.
Well, I think one of the interesting things, you've talked about a couple things here around minimal viable product, agile approach, ranges versus averages, a number on the page. And these are all things that I think by and large, especially in a business context, looking backwards, people were a lot less comfortable with, right? They want everything to be completely baked and perfect, generally speaking. They want to know the number and what it's going to be. They want to understand that with some certainty. Because I've lived in this world for some amount of time, I think in just about anything I do, even things like going out to a restaurant with my wife, I don't think necessarily we're going to that restaurant. What if they're full? What if there's something else, which tends to drive her a little bit crazy at certain points in time. But I guess what I'm saying is I always think there's a potential alternate path that can be taken with some amount of reasonableness as I go along and just live.
I have been blamed for always having a plan B by some people. And that sounds similar to that. I have taken this to an extreme at times. So Adam, we have maybe another couple minutes here. Where would you, so let's talk about, come back to value in business, and where would you like to push the IoT conversation? Where do you think we are not going far enough in terms of where could there be more value shared, more risk shared, more reward shared, and you don't see enough of it yet, specifically in IoT? I know you talked about supply chain. I know you're deep into this. I'm just, open up the aperture as wide as you'd like, but it's almost like, whom would you invite to come and talk to us about value and sharing the risk? What you haven't seen yet.
Well, so the interesting thing I think about IoT is, if it doesn't work in many cases, you don't necessarily lose anything, right? You're just where you were before. And all your systems and all your operations and everything else functions as it did before. So the loss is really one of what the opportunity was. And I think what I see happening in the IoT world as people are figuring it out and learning it, so standard business, not somebody, like the guys in our practice that really have embraced this stuff for years, they're experimenting. So they're doing something over here to learn from it, or doing something over there in a fairly small way. And then they're stepping back and they're saying, hey, we did get some value from that. Do we want to do something else? I think there's an opportunity as people learn, understanding that the floor is not going to drop out here. It's just a matter of what's the upside, to do more of a programmatic approach. Go a little bit bigger, go a little bit broader, try and roll this stuff out, and try and think of it in such a way that for your business, you can create a competitive advantage, right? Do something that is perhaps harder to replicate, that your competitors can't, and get you ahead of the game in some way, shape, or form. One of the interesting things I think about IoT is it can increase the speed by which you go to market. It can increase the way you support innovation. It can drive better service. It can certainly drive better cost profiles. All these things are ways that you can win in the market, especially if you go a little bit faster, a little bit broader using the technology than perhaps what we're seeing.
Is this what I tend to call think big, start small, scale fast?
Yes, absolutely. That's a good way to think about it, right? Once you have something proven here, ramp that up, right? It's working for you. You're gaining some value out of it. Let's go after it.
And your point is good, right? The loss is typically loss of opportunity rather than the actual loss of significant amount of money, particularly if you start small. You didn't give exact examples, sort of like these 3 examples to go after. Was this on purpose, or you have some?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think a couple of use cases in IoT that are really important. First one is what I call, lighting up the dark areas of the business, usually on something perhaps inbound. So some sort of inbound transportation, supplier to yourself, and certainly outbound, right? Then you also have the factory in the middle, and you can light that up. So visibility across all of those is going to push on all the value drivers and erase the V's that I talked about a little bit earlier. I think once you do that, the next natural use case is, now that we have all these data sets and we can see what's happening, let's build some optimization on top of that and be able to optimize the way our operations run in ways they haven't before. And that's only because now IoT and different sensors are allowing us to pull that in. And then from there, you can build machine learning on top of that and perhaps start to think about things like machine-to-machine communication, so you get a lot more efficient and different sort of instructions electronically rippling across your supply chain in order to drive benefits.
Adam, thank you for coming on. It was great having you. I enjoyed our conversation. Any closing thoughts on your end?
Just that this is an exciting area, and to the point of this conversation, an incredibly valuable area, right? It's worth pushing in. I think the use cases, people are learning as they go, but we haven't seen anything where it hasn't been accretive to a company. So it's worth driving hard and driving fast in this direction.
Yeah, we just released a blog that I wrote about how the Internet of Things will soon become the Internet again, because it's just things are going to be connected. And
yes,
we talked about this in the supply chain from all the way back to finished product, all the way to the customer. So interesting, exciting times. Adam, thank you so much for joining. This was Coffee with Mr. IoT, and it's coming to a close. Please join me next week again, Friday, 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern, for another Coffee with Mr. IoT. And by the way, if you missed any part of today's conversation, come back and watch it on my YouTube channel. See you next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Bye.